G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic Saturday and so far a fantastic weekend, or at least a better weekend than I was just filming before. Not only did I forget to save it, I also had a box gutter in my house overflow with water because the weather here is absolutely insane and it's flooded inside one of my walls. So that will be very, very fun to deal with over the coming couple of days. But legends, let's push on. So, of course, first up, we need to talk about these strikes. Over the past 36 hours, Russia has carried out a number of missile and drone attacks against Ukraine. Now, some are saying this is retaliation. Some are saying that is still to come. The Russian pages are disappointed it wasn't greater. The Ukrainian pages are making fun that it wasn't a larger attack. But let's talk more about that. Now, as you know, I don't really report that much on drone and missile strikes unless it hits something really important or it is, a huge over-the-top attack, because I'm more interested in seeing the long-term effect of this, because strategic strikes, what they are there to do, they never win wars. No matter what, you cannot win a ground war from the air. This war will be settled on the ground. But what strategic strikes are there for? Missiles, drones, Russian, Ukrainian. They're there to increase the cost for your adversary. And of course, then that cost and limiting logistics, blah, 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 will then have an effect for then the elements on the front line, those that seize and hold terrain. And speaking of seizing and holding terrain, we'll be looking at the maps, going over geolocations, comparing maps, all of that. And then the main meat of this video is I want to talk about dirty war, something we have been going over now for a couple of years on this channel. You and I have been speaking that this war is going to get more nasty, more brutal before it gets better. And with then protracted attritional war, a lot of your self-imposed restrictions start going out the window, and we're seeing more attacks outside of the borders of conflict. So wait out on that. We're going to talk more about it. So let's start with these strikes, and it's currently raining very heavily again. Fingers crossed my house doesn't end up flooded again. Now, what we saw was large attacks over the past 36 hours. And a few little bits I wanted to show you here. You've probably seen this before, but this is some of the best footage of this. This is a KH-101, then air-launched cruise missile, Russian cruise missile, and you can see these flare decoys going out. And this was an upgrade to this system over the years of this war. Of course, this is to trick air defense going after it. And we did see that was in Lutsk. This is in Lutsk too. Many are reporting this as Kaliber missiles, but I believe this would be KH-101, given the nature of where these landed, striking a number of areas said to be in this industrial zone in Lutsk here. So you can see a number of successful strikes too. Now, it is highly, highly illegal in Ukraine to film any of this, and we don't get the satellite imagery you may get in other areas. So it's very hard to actually have a battle damage assessment. But this wasn't some absolutely massive attack. But we have spoken about, could this be preparing the battle space for larger attacks? And one of the biggest things we hear from Ukraine and Ukrainian leaders is the shortage of air defense, particularly those like Patriot that can only strike some of the Russian missiles. And what we see here, this is over Kyiv, this is an Iskander M coming in, a Russian Iskander, and a Ukrainian Patriot firing then 4 interceptors from that. So that is a lot. Air defense is very expensive and there's not that much of it. And what we have spoken about is, could Russia be having a number of attacks to really just grind down that air defense, and then they're going to start having more successful attacks as there's nothing to then intercept some of these then missiles. So that could be the case. But we have seen a lot of pages, I guess, complaining that this wasn't large enough. And we see Fighter Bomber here speak about that if this was our response to what has then actually happened, well, he's a bit disappointed. And it turned out to be nothing. If this is the maximum we are capable of without using nuclear weapons, he basically says we need to stop dragging our feet and then start using nuclear weapons, which is incredibly over the top at this point. There's no need for any of those systems. They are for a threat to the existence of the state. But he says, while we're still able to do this, and this is something that he has spoken about, is he did say in yesterday, I believe we shared it, that after that strike on the Tu-95s, Tu-22s, that no, it's not critical now, but if there's more attacks like this, we may not be able to put more of these back in the air. Again, it's a good example of what I'm talking about, of people are disappointed this wasn't larger. But I'm not surprised at all to see that. And I spoke about that on the day of the video we reported on those Tu-95s and 22s burning, the first video we did. I had in that, what do I think the response is going to be? And I said, I don't think we're going to see much of a massive response. And I gave the reasons to this. But was this attack the response, or will we see more? Well, time will tell, I guess, over the next few days. But I don't see the benefit for Russia in launching a one-off massive attack purely for optics, because what this could do is it could compromise your ability to conduct follow-up attacks on then subsequent days following. And attritional war is all about constant pressure in multiple areas. And this doesn't just mean on different axes on the front lines. It's constant pressure diplomatically, it's constant pressure strategically, tactically, economically, all of that. It's all in the what's the word I'm looking for? The orchestra of attritional war. And this is all just instruments within that to have it. And what I say all the times, and this is what I've been saying, is the biggest critique I have of Ukrainian successes, whether it is success in Kursk, initial success in Kursk, or the success of taking out these bombers, is that's great. But in attritional war, you need to have simultaneous and successive actions, not just peaks and troughs, because you have that success and then you need to exploit to the nth degree of that. And that was, Kursk is the greatest example of this, is there was early large success, but there was no simultaneous or successive actions that ended up being a peak and trough, and actually then well below the x-axis following this. So what I said in that video, and I believe still holds up, is that we'll probably see a 10 or 15% increase in missiles and drones used, but not a huge one-off, because what that can do is that can compromise and sacrifice that tempo of just future operations night after night after night, and that constant pressure on those systems and not being able to refill them. Because if you launch 100 missiles and then you can't have an attack for a week, well, Ukraine's going to be able to backfill those AD systems in an amount of time as well. And what I'll say is, unlike for Ukraine, Ukraine is completely reliant on international support, primarily from countries practicing democracy, is optics are unbelievably important to keep that up. For Russia, what is domestically supported on the most, optics are not as important. Now, they still are important, but not as important. And I think these commanders will be going, yeah, optics may be embarrassing, but this is still a ground war of which we are currently winning the ground war. We just need to keep pressing on in that attritional nature and constant pressure on all the elements of war, from politics to the front line to the air warfare as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if we actually don't see a huge response to it, because the negative of having a huge response from Russia too, I don't know, you might take out some targets, but then you're going to give a lot of ammunition to particularly the European states of going, well, we need to deliver far more. So it's that constant pressure, I believe, will be likely what we see. Maybe an uptick in tactical aviation. So let's have a look at the maps, and thank God that rain has stopped. I'm on edge. Here's Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. The red check that you will see is updates over the past 24 hours. We have 2 days of maps to go over today. It updated late yesterday. But firstly, let's come up into Sumy, Ukraine, Kursk, Russia. And what we can see is Russia is expanding control here more quickly than other areas, well, all other areas of the front line, and has expanded this out to 185 kilometer squares. I believe it's probably closer to 200 realistically, but regardless, have expanded a lot of control there, and that's the problem of opening up Kursk, and then you didn't have successive simultaneous actions. It's then fallen then below that axis and has been unable to then stop. I think we'll look back on this war whenever it ends, and hopefully soon, and hopefully with less cost, we will go, that was a large tactical strategic error. But so let's look in here, and what we want to look for is Yanakivka, Yambalivka in this sector, just lining up, because we're firstly going to then have a look at Suryak maps. Now, what he is saying, the biggest difference here is he's saying that Yambalivka, this here, has then been occupied, and the Russians are right down to their southern extreme of this intersection right here. Now, let's measure this. I believe it's about 3.8 kilometers. Yeah, 3.65, close enough. So 3.6 kilometers back there. And then see this tree line in here. He's also suggesting the Russians are down into this area as well, but making ground across that border. Now, an area which is being ignored by many of the maps, and we have spoken a little bit of it, and I did suggest maybe a week back, I just want to mention it just in case, is Thankyou. Now, this is the problem with a map like Deep State that's in with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, because there's incentive here on a couple of things. There's incentive not to show Russian gain, but then there's like informational incentive not to spoil any operations, so they may not want to keep right up to date with the forefront of the Ukrainian line of if they're on the offensive, because they don't want to show or release any information. We saw this happening with Kursk, but Thankyou, nothing being shown here. But if we go on to AMK mapping, this shows very, very different. And he says Ukrainian forces have made significant progress in the Kursk Oblast over the past few weeks, and in the recent days achieved localized breakthrough. And what we're looking for is, this is Thankyou, the center down in here, but we can see that he's suggesting the Ukrainian forces have come on this axes right here and have actually crossed this main service route and have really potentially cut off some of the Russian forces in here. He says initially, after a series of failed attacks, Ukrainian forces under extremely heavy air, artillery and drone cover managed to break through the international border and entrench on the westernmost street of Thankyou. Russian counterattacks managed to claw back some of the houses, but Ukraine was able to bring in sufficient supplies from the village from Razivka in Sumy, and the Russian attacks bogged down. And we do know, or from Surak, he's suggesting that the Russian VDV are deploying into here to try and unbreak what has occurred. So wait out on this. There's not many other mappers that I trust and show actually showing it, because there's a lot of maps out there that I'm like, on. I say wait on Deep State, because they do have incentive, especially with the news coming off the front line day after day after day, to show some blue check on this map. But just wait out on that. It's worth just keeping in the back of our brain knowing, yep, there is definitely something going on happening in here, and waiting for further geolocations to confirm movements also. So let's move into then the northeast. We're in the far north now, we're in the northeast, and we're looking for Kupiansk, very important hub city. But what I've spoken about, the problem here is that the Oskil River runs down here, and you could end up with a situation where we have in the east, the west, and further actions in here could make it very difficult to bring all the heavy equipment over here, then across that waterway. Bodies of water are the most difficult aspect for any armoured artillery or infantry movements. So let's have a look in here, as there are some important pieces. We have Kindrashivkia that is shown somewhat in grey zone, but we know that this is likely occupied today, or at least somewhat, because on these western blocks here, some 2.1 kilometres from the line of control shown here, what we see is then these Russian forces flying a Russian national flag and then a unit flag as well at, I believe, probably an old war memorial here, probably a Soviet memorial there, and that's just right where my cursor is right here, I believe, or maybe just to the west of where I showed, but close enough. It's in these blocks here, and that is, of course, making that western flank of Kupiansk, but on the western side of the Oskil. Now, I spoke about the problem with that waterway, and this is something we need to look at as well. So just to the east of Ozyanovo, which is right here, where my cursor is, we do see that a bridge has been taken down here previously, and then a temporary bridge has been put in, and then Russian missiles have struck this here. Cuts off before we could do a BDA. Likely that bridge needs a hell of a lot of repairs or a new temp bridge put in. And of course, this has a lot of problems out in this sector here, especially because of the waterway and the southern and northern flanks being under Russian control. So let's move our way down the map just a little bit, and then we'll come to Terny, and you can see where this movement is out to the Oskil. And what I've been saying is I believe Russia will now work on the north and southern flanks to fatten this, to desaturate the Ukrainian drones and artillery while increasing their own lines of control here. And we somewhat see this. We haven't seen much extreme western movement here, but we are seeing a lot of working around Kolodyazy and Zelenodolnya as well. So this is then Zelenodolnya, this is Kolodyazy. And he's suggesting close enough to see where the grey zone is here. He's suggesting that that grey is actually red. And this is a very common theme with Syriac maps, is whatever the deep state shows as grey, Syriac shows as red. And what I will say, by the geolocations, a lot of the time, he is very correct. So we'll continue our way down into Seversk. We can see that there is a minor envelopment of Seversk, but this forested area up here is a blessing for Ukraine, and that the defense around Kursk has been very, very good, except for recent gains around Verkhono-Mayansky as well. But just to the south of Seversk, we can see there is, where my cursor is, there's a bridge sitting right there, and what we know is that Ukraine has rigged to blow all the bridges, or a lot of the bridges at the front line, in case they need to withdraw out. They can crump them as they go. What we know recently over the past months is Russia has found this out, and what they can do, instead of firing $1 million missile at the bloody thing, they can fly a $500 FPV drone in and then strike where these are rigged to blow, and then we can see these bridges going down. Remember, a couple of months back, we saw this happening actually again and again. So this bridge right here, this has then been taken down. So wait out on that actual effect here. Again, like I said, war is an orchestra, and each little piece from strategic strikes, tactical strikes, infantry, armour, all of this through to your logistics, they're just instruments to make a symphony, okay? But if one instrument drops out or one gets added in, you may not notice it straight away, but it will be a more full operation by the end, if that makes sense. So we'll continue our way down, and then we'll get into, we'll actually start at the Pokrovsk eastern side. And if we go back, I believe, to then yesterday, because we've shown you all the red check on the map from today, and then as we see around Zoroya, Romanivka, that this has come under control. Personally, I think this has been red for some time. To be honest, that it actually would be less concerning the way Syriac shows the maps of day-to-day smaller 1 or 2 kilometre gains than if this is correct and there's been an over 5 kilometre gain in a day. I'll show that in a second of a large gain. But do we have a Pokrovsk eastern map? I thought I had a geolocation. Maybe I don't. Okay. No, I've got one just to show you in here. So yes, that's now confirmed of this. Let's then come down to Velika and Pokrovsk sector, because this is now sort of joining up in two axes. Velika Novosilka. Now, Fedorivka up to Komar, we can see this advancement here. And this is what I'm speaking about, of gains over multiple days. It would actually be less concerning if I was a commander than updating all at once. We see 6.88 kilometres advancement by this map in a day. That is a lot. Go and walk 7 Ks in a straight line. That is a hell of a long way. Now, when I said this is concerning is I don't think it's moved like this, because what this shows is manoeuvre warfare. And if Russia has been able to reintroduce manoeuvre into the battlefield, that is a larger concern, because that tells a lot about then Ukraine's attrition rate and ability to maintain on the front, more so than just a grinding war forward. Does that make sense? The ultimate goal of attritional protracted war is to reintroduce deep manoeuvre. And realistically, what I think this looks like is I think it looks more like this, that it's been grinding forward through Dnipro-Hyrylia, through Vasily, up to Fyodivka, into Komar over a number of weeks, just day by day, grinding forward a couple of 100 metres at a time. And this is what then Syriac shows here, is that Fyodivka has basically come under control, as well as breaking into Komar. So the northern extreme is similar, but then Vasily isn't shown occupied like it is on this. And I think likely it's just been more of a grind forwards. But I do have a geolocation here that I actually believe is outside of where Syriac and Deep State is showing right here. So to the northern side of Vyodivka, it's only a couple hundred metres, but at 55 seconds we see a Russian flag go up just about here, and then another one go up right here. Now, if you're wondering why these two look slightly different on the grey zone, is the grey zone expand because this was yesterday only slightly, okay? And this is the footage right in here. I should have just screenshotted this, but we'll skip forward to 50. Look at that. 55 exactly. We said, oh, yep, okay. This is that eastern side, and then, did I say 109? Boys, 109.55, 2 clicks straight on them after the bad luck day. Anyway, and then we see that geolocation right there. So we know that movement and what's been occurring, grinding forward. But that is a long, long way in behind one of those main defensive lines as well. And then we see this movement to the north of Hodorkove, west of Troitsky, that the Russian forces have made ground towards Dnipro Oblast. Now, is anything going to happen when that line is crossed? No, but I do believe it will be an informational victory because there will be an entry into another oblast. And we can see by this map here, movement, again, grey zone is basically the red zone of confirming that movement right there. So wait out on that, but map's still moving, and this sort of gain, that is concerning in behind defensive lines and continuing and exploiting in one of, if not the most heavily defended area. So wait out on that. Also wait out on then to get keen on what the situation is actually happening up there. Oh, sorry, one more. And then we come down Huliapol, which if you've followed me for a while, we made a couple of videos in Huliapol. The Russians actually got a lot closer to Huliapol than these maps ever showed back in 2022. We're looking for a Malanivka. We can see a large band of grey here. And what Syriac says is he's basically saying the positions that were under grey zone have now been taken by then the Russian forces, and they're in the outskirts of Malanivka. Wait out on that. I'll try and find as many geolocations as I can. Now, something that you and I have been speaking about for a long time is as the war goes on, as with all protracted war, that it ends up getting more and more brutal, it gets more savage, and your initial restrictions, that your self-imposed initial restrictions, they get jettisoned. And we see this in many, many different aspects of war. And this article, this is what I wanted to speak on today. So Ukraine's dirty war is just getting started. Covert strikes across Russia and beyond are reshaping a conflict that shows no signs of letting up. And the head of the SBU says, well, this is a serious slap in the face of the power of the Russian Federation, of course, against those TU bombers. And some Ukrainian supporters hope the strikes might mark a breakthrough in the war. Again, this is an instrument in the orchestra. It's not that it's not important, but you're never going to just have a single aspect and change the whole thing. It needs to have change the entire tune, okay? But what's ahead appears to be a bloody continuation of this terrible conflict. Yes, what people are forgetting is that at the end of the day, this is a ground war. Okay, I see a lot of people talking today about container ships with drone boats on them to strike Russia's Pacific Fleet. Now, yes, that will definitely increase the cost of the war if that was to occur. But this is still a ground war that will not have immediate effect on the front line. And I think there's too much effort put into optics-based warfare resource rather than trying to actually stabilize that front line, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if they're making 7 kilometers like in one area potentially in a day. Okay, but it is about increasing costs, so wait out on that. It is all important, but it can't, what I say is it has to be a healthy balance. It can't just be all and all, okay? And this is something we spoke about over the past years, that as the war continues, it will get more savage, and the self-imposed restrictions, you'll jettison them, and the goalposts of what you consider there will move. And protracted war inevitably grows more brutal, but it also grows more difficult to end. And Iskander Raman, in his book, Planning for Protraction, who I've interviewed him, it's on the podcast if you'd like to look it up, just Google his name and my name. He says, as increasingly frustrated and vengeful antagonists progressively jettison their self-imposed operational restrictions and moral reservations, as war then continues. And we see this from examples of gas entering World War I, unrestricted submarine warfare, and even as war goes on, then you're willing to conscript unwilling and then untrained men and throw them into the fire. And this is why all protracted war eventually turns into an attritional battle, because even smaller and larger states can lock each other in an attritional war over time, but also you're willing to go further and further. And like I said about India, Pakistan, yes, on paper, India has significantly more power than Pakistan, but Pakistan has enough power to lock India into an attritional battle. And the goal of attrition is to raise the cost on your enemy, to break and limit their material to a point of exhaustion, okay? And don't underestimate how far a country can go to, that when you think they're exhausted, probably got a lot left. And we can see from early catastrophic losses, ability to reconstitute as well. And what I will say, historically, Russia's ability to recover, reconstitute from catastrophic loss, whether against Napoleon, whether against Nazis, whether against catastrophic initial losses in this war as well, from the failed war of maneuver to switching to a war of attrition. Okay, don't underestimate it, because now we have the Germans, both the German Chief of Defence and the German Chancellor, saying that Russia will be able to reconstitute by 29 to the point of maybe fighting NATO. Okay, but let's sit on this dirty war part. That the focus will shift from inflicting cost on your adversary, even at the expense of strategic or tactical victories. That everything will be right. It doesn't matter strategic or tactical value. What can we just inflict cost at this point? And as I've stated, once one nation starts losing, an event horizon then gets crossed and it's looking like it's all going there, in the desperation of this, we will see a lot of limits jettisoned and the war grow more brutal, including in the informational space, which is part of war. Now, second slide here, and this begs the question, though, of if Russia was to start collapsing, what would then be stopping an existential threat of that, of use of chem, bio, nuclear weapons here, or then using proxy state leverage? Now, people talk about nukes all the time, and I think at this point, seeing what we're seeing, it's very, very, not going to happen. But the best leverage that Russia could have, especially on the US, is being able to level playing fields in other areas of the globe, going, right, well, we are going to give nuclear tech to Iran or North Korea, and that has a huge shift very, very quickly. And this threat of both of this, of the use of these catastrophic weapons or use of tech to countries that are inherently anti-West, this goes into the idea of, especially the Biden administration, was to give enough aid to Ukraine to slow the Russians, but never enough aid to win against it and then have a collapse of then the Russian Federation either. Although human resource there likely was never enough for that anyway. But you get the idea of that sort of dragging feet. But on the other hand here, what about Ukraine? As this war is going to continue and it will become more and more desperate, and what we're seeing is more and more ability and willingness to target inside of Russia. And as it gets more desperate, will we see then restrictions further jettisoned, and maybe even to the point, I know this is dirty war, he's referring to just basically intelligence war here, or making it messy, but of even to the point of developing something like dirty bombs, absolutely could happen, or further use of malicious actors. And we have spoken over years about the ability for this is absolutely there as well. And we've seen a lot of this too. We've seen multiple car bombs. We've seen Dugin's daughter get targeted. We've seen now Operation Spiderweb. We've seen targeting of trains. So we're seeing a lot more of this dirty intelligence style cost increasing war. And some of these, as I stated in this slide here, regardless of tactical or strategic victory, to inflict cost and suffering. Dugin's daughter, a big one in this. And what I'll say is all of these publicly have received little to no backlash from supporting liberal states, and likely highly enabling states in some of these as well. Although some of these, not Operation Spiderweb, there was problems in it, but overall, but some of these like Dugin, whatever, trains are definitely crossing both legal and ethical boundaries. But what we do know is a lot of countries, they're willing to jettison and forgo standards implied on others when it suits themselves. We'll go over that more in a second. As Mearsheimer says, and if you really want to get an idea of Mearsheimer, read The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. You can see the mess I've made of going through it over the past, well, it took me like a couple of weeks to really get through it back in the day. But he says, liberal democracies do not always act according to the dictates of liberal theory. When they face a serious threat, they often act accordingly to the dictates of realism. And he talks about this in Can China Rise Peacefully in that book. I think it's chapter 10, if you want to just read that section. And realism, the way he describes it in his view, it doesn't prescribe a good or bad states. It basically just means that the system in itself is anarchic, and the power and survival of the state is first and foremost by whatever means necessary. And Kissinger, he'll refer to this as far as the raison d'etat, of the reason of state, of that a state's survival, security and power are priorities. And these priorities are put above morality, ideology and personal values. Okay, and protracted war breeds more of this. Now, ultimately, what we are pondering here is if Ukraine's conventional warfare ability cannot defeat Russia on the battlefield, which is what it's looking like, and Zelensky has basically said that, then how far is Western-backed Ukraine willing to go in dirtier operations, if you will, or grey operations, not only in Russia but in other areas? What is Europe willing to enable, or maybe willing to justify? What about the US? And what we know is the Western goal here, their goal ultimately, first and foremost, is the survival of their state. In this war, the second goal is to weaken Russia, and these two are not mutually exclusive. The survival of their state and weakening Russia, especially, say, for the Baltics, is hand in hand. And third here is then the survival of Ukraine. Okay, and I believe the rhetoric versus reality has shown this in backing out of negotiations that guaranteed a survival here for trying to further then the first 2 points that are put here. And what we see is further rhetoric in this as well versus reality now that's becoming unable to be hidden, is the Germans saying that Russia will have the power in 2029 potentially for an invasion on NATO, while also then repeating that Ukraine can or will win the ground war with a bit more supply, which is the Schrodinger's box if I've ever heard of it. And there's been no greater example of what I'm getting to in this, of being willing to forgo your own standards, morality, ideology and personal values, as far as liberal states act more idealist, but then in a lot of war act way more realist. There's no more great example of this than what we're seeing unfold with a Western ally of Israel in Gaza. That there really is a hierarchy of human suffering and an inequality compassion put against different wars depending on what we see. And one thing I've been thinking about recently is the West is completely backing Ukraine, okay? If Ukraine did to Russia what Israel has done to Gaza, I still believe the Western powers will step in and go, you can't do that. If that makes sense, like that's too far. But again, we're talking about how far could it actually go in this? And as it becomes more and more existential, as the lines are crossed, lines are going to get shifted, goalpost moves going to get more blurry. And this is a couple here. The SBU-GUR, Ukraine's two spy agencies, so then domestic and military intelligence, have been working in 3 years to deliver on the motto of Ukraine's special forces being, I'm coming for you. They've run operations to take the battle into Russia and abroad against its forces and partners around the world. The goal has been to strike unexpected locations through devious means and make Russia bleed far beyond the front lines in Ukraine. We even saw at one point spokesmen saying to hunt down propagandists as well. And what I've said at the time was, well, the threshold for being a propagandist is unbelievably low, but how far is this willing to go? And Dugin's a good example of this. Actually, let's do this slide before we talk about that one. Ukraine's readiness to launch risky spy operations has produced recurring tension between Washington and Kyiv. The assassination of Daria Dugin, the daughter of the Russian writer Alexander Dugin, who we believe, they say, was likely the target, but we know Daria was killed there. But even Dugin in no way, shape or form was a legitimate military target. There's no evidence, and I've tried to find as much as I can, of him actually meeting or advising on Putin. At the end of the day, he's a philosopher. He can have some very radical ideas, absolutely. But at the end of the day, he is a philosopher, has some radical ideas, no more radical than any Twitter or Telegram page you will actually see. But absolutely not, and especially his daughter was absolutely not a target. And we will likely see more and more of this as it goes on. And yes, there may be tension between Washington and Kyiv, but how far is this really willing to go before it would be gripped up? Because we've seen absolutely no public threshold put to push and go, that can't happen. The only time we saw that, the only time I believe, and this is speculation from my point of view, is, objection speculation, is when those Ukrainian drones hit the Russian over-the-horizon radars, and it never happened since because it was an important part of the early warning for nuclear systems. Geotactic has been to strike Russian mercenary forces from Wagner Group in Africa. Hear about this. Numbers, again, you know what I think about numbers, but Budanov told me we conduct such operations aimed at reducing Russian military potential anywhere where it's possible. Why should Africa be an exception? Well, countries can be an exception if they're invited in as well, but also back to this slide where I talk about taking down these boundaries to work potentially with malicious actors. And we have seen both in Africa and Syria working with maybe not people you'd invite to your mum and dad's house for dinner, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, I'm not saying if I wasn't in an agency at a war like this, I wouldn't be doing the same thing. But what I'm saying is the further and further and more costly this war goes on, and the fallacy, the cost fallacy increases, it's going to get harder to stop and more savage, and we just don't know how far this will go. The spillover danger affects all other countries bordering Ukraine: Belarus, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, as well as Germany, the Baltic states, Norway and Finland. Most of these countries support Ukraine. The Ukrainian intelligence service use Eastern European capitals as hubs for their operations and will be absolutely being enabled by basically everyone too. It's all too easy to imagine widening campaign of Russian sabotage and assassination threats such as those that began last year. And, of course, there's more and more of this going on. Have you ever wondered why so many military plants in Europe catch on fire? A lot of that is to do with Russian intelligence operations occurring as well. But where Ukraine has an intelligence services with the backing of dozens of other intelligence services, Russians is operating on FSB, SVR, GRU, and we don't know how much connection there would be to the, what do they call it, ministry, the MSS, who's the Chinese Ministry of State Security. It might be incorrect, but yet we absolutely are seeing there's a lot more of this going on than people actually realise. Ukraine won't be forced to be neutral. It's set on its own sheet of terms. And that's what I'm saying is if the front line is given, if we can't win here, we have to get more dirty. How far is it willing to go, and how far is the supporting states willing to let that go also? As I've stated, the war is going to get more messy as it continues. Relationships will be strained, other states may be drawn in, and it will continue into other theatres during and after the fighting. There will be proxy conflicts following this proxy in many other areas. America, under Trump's position, seems to be where they want to prevent spillover of the war. They don't want it then expanding, and they don't want military alliances with America's competitors being formed either. China, the main one, well, the one, and they do want to prevent escalation that has potential of extinction, of course, escalation in nuclear systems as well. So that's sort of where Trump's position is, and that seems to be vastly different from where the Western, where Europe's position is sitting. So we will see, but Europe is going to go through a big change because not only is America pulling out of NATO, but NATO needed America because European NATO, because they weren't powerful enough. And now they've got a foot up the arse and a rebuilding, and especially Germany. Well, what we see there, we will see a power balance shift amongst alliance there as well in Europe. And that'll be very interesting for neighbouring states too, to see when arms races start going, what actually occurs there. And as I've said, a byproduct of this war, I think, is going to be not only that it's going to get more messy but towards the end, but more smaller states are going to seek nuclear weapons, because a state like Ukraine, which likely will not end up in NATO, they will go with the only other guarantees is extinction level weapons, that a state like Australia may go and go, at the end of the day, our security with you is a signature on a piece of paper. We know those have fallen apart before. A state like Australia may seek nuclear armament, and I think many, many other states may also. Anyway, a lot that we went over there, but the TLDR is we're going to see more operations like spiderweb, like direct targeting, not only in Russia, but in other areas as well. And we've seen targeting in many, many states also. So, legends, you have a fantastic day. I'm going to go assess my damage. Look after yourself. Bye-bye.